Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our event. We see that quite a few people are joining, so we'll just gonna slowly start and progress with this webinar. We have a lot of people joining, quite a lot of interest to this topic and to this webinar. So a huge thank you for everyone who registered and joining us today. Before I say a few more words about the webinar and what we are trying to do today, I will give the floor very briefly to my colleague Emmy, just to say a few words about the translation and practicality so everyone is clear in all languages what we are doing. Emmy, go ahead.
Thank you, Soraya. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Emmy from Eurodat, and I will quickly share a couple of practical details about this call. This webinar is being recorded and will be published on ODG and Eurodat's YouTube accounts, so you can rewatch it and share it within your network. And interpretation is available in French, and you can activate it by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom right of the Zoom window. And finally, all questions are welcome, and you can ask them directly in the chat or during the Q&A by raising your hand, and we will give you the floor. And yeah, I hope you enjoy this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmy, very much. I hope that was clear to everyone. But if there are any questions at any point in the process, please do let us know. We can always answer them if there are any difficulties. So this webinar, a warm welcome again to if you joined in the last couple of minutes. This webinar is part of the series of learning sessions actually we have been doing together with the partners within the DEAR project called Connecting the Dots that focuses on the activities promoting climate justice, economic justice, and gender justice. So we have done few of those, and this one we extended actually to more of you considering the interest that the conversations have generated in the past, and we are very happy to see that so many of you actually registered for this event. And this particular webinar, which is the third one in the series that we've been conducting, it's actually focused on feminism and decoloniality and reparations and debts. So we will explore this theme today with all of you, and also together with our two exciting speakers who will be joining us in a moment. And yeah, there will be space for conversations, for discussions, for questions as we go in this webinar. And now I will pass the word to Nicola from ODG to introduce the speakers and to introduce a bit more about the content of our webinar. Nicola, please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. Sorry for the technical issue with the passport code. Thanks for those who make it. Sorry, I just got a bit distracted here because people are still writing me. I'll get this done and I'll be with you 100%. So thank you very much for joining today. I'm Nicola Scherer. I'm from the Debt Observatory in Globalization based in Barcelona. And we have been looking very forward to doing or opening up this dialogue, this space today, to talk about feminism and decoloniality, invisible debts and reparations. I have the pleasure to present to you our two speakers today. Welcome with me, Reine Baimey. She is a Pan-African ecofeminist, militant and activist. She's also the Debt and Reparation Program Coordinator of WoMin, African Alliance. And I'll present to you also Corinna Dengler. She is a feminist, ecological economist and deco scholar and activist. And she's working at the Institute for Spatial and Social-Ecological Transformation at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. We have now around 45 minutes of guided dialogues between both of our speakers. And then we also have 15 minutes to give you the chance for everybody who's joining to ask questions. So as we said, please, if you hear something, if you feel you would like to know more, please write your questions in the chats. We will all collect them, and then in this, at the end, 15 minutes, we give space to your questions, and we'll invite our speakers to answer those questions. And that's basically the next hour we'll spend together. So Then let's start. My first question would go to Corinna, and I would ask you if you could explain why did you focus on working on depth, a bit about where you come from, and what is your conceptual framework you use to explain invisible depths? All yours. And I may ask Amy if we can switch to speakers. I don't know, say speakers format so we can see Corinna speaking, if this is possible. Okay.
Yes, yeah.
The floor is yours.
Okay, hi from my side also, and thanks so much for hosting this webinar. So to Nicola, to Soraya, to also comrades from the Global Debt Observatory and from Eurodot. And it's really nice that so many people are showing up. And I'm very happy that I was invited as a speaker to the seminar also. So your first question, I think, was how did I come to work on debt? And actually, so I've long followed debates on ecological debt. It has always been inspirational to me, the concept of ecological debt. Most of you are probably aware it was coined as a critical intervention at the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. And since then, it has been raised in a variety of cases. So, for example, famously with Texaco in Ecuador or against Shell in Nigeria. It's been brought up in a lot of occasions. I'm thinking, for example, on the G77 summit, South Summit in Havana, and embraced by many organizations such as Friends of the Earth or Jubilee South. And I have long followed those debates on ecological debt, mainly because I have always found them to be very useful in challenging or actually rebutting the flawed arguments that Europe or any country in the global north would be a leader in combating climate change. So I always found this question of in a way, inverting the question of who owes whom as something that ecological debt does very well. And then over the last years, I have observed, and not only as a scholar, but also as an activist, like in social movements, I found it very interesting that this topic of debt has been repoliticized quite a lot. So I have followed the debates on debt and this ecological debt, climate debt sphere before, but then I found it very interesting that it came up more and more in feminist circles. I'm talking here, for example, about the Ni Una Menos movement, starting from Argentina. At the time, Lucy Caballero and Veronica Gago also wrote this book, Feminist Reading of Debt, which I think stirred quite a lot of debate. And so feminist movements really started with the slogan, "We want ourselves alive, free and out of debt." And I found it interesting, so to say, that this topic of debt came up more and more in this sphere as well. And then, of course, in decolonial anti-racist movements, this claim for reparations got ever bigger. So, for example, claimed by the US movement for Black Lives or by CARICOM, we could see that also there, social movements gathered around this topic of debt. So I found suddenly that in broadly saying the three spheres of scholarship and activism that I'm most interested in, which are like environmental justice, feminisms, and decoloniality, and all three of them quite separately from each other. So the topic of debt came up and was politicized quite a bit. So that was really the starting point for me to think about how to, in a way, find a conceptual umbrella or something that can unite, so to say, so three different streams. And so that was for me the starting point for thinking about invisible debt. And I think your second question was like, where does the concept come from, or what do I build on conceptually in this notion of invisible debt? And you said in your introduction that I'm a feminist ecological economist, and as such, I always like to look at, or not like to look, but I think in feminist ecological economics, what we do is looking at the economy from the ground up, from what is commonly externalized, from what is commonly invisible. And there is this metaphor by ecofeminist Maria Mies that I think is very illustrative here. So Maria Mies talks of the iceberg economy. And so what is commonly referred to as the economy is really only the visible tip of an iceberg. That what is measured in monetary terms, that what is counted in GDP. And this tip of the iceberg, it could never exist without its underwater foundation, which is usually much bigger than the tip, as we know as well. And it consists of, among other things, unpaid care work, of nature, of subsistence work, of community work. So coming from this metaphor, from this image of the iceberg, the question would be, how would our perception of what debt is and what debt relations in a global political economy are if we didn't look at it only from the water surface, but really from, so to say, from the ground up? And back then I had a conversation with a colleague of mine, Anil Shah, and he recommended, so I was thinking about this topic of debt, social movements, the iceberg metaphor. And he then recommended a book which was then newly published by Max Haven called Revenge Capitalism. And specifically, he said that this concept that Haven uses for from debt from above versus debt from below would fit very well in there. And I found them to be really helpful in this regard, because, and so what Haven sees as debts from above are really the regular form of debts that we see. A creditor is owed by a debtor. This debt relationship is formalized within the dominant institutional framework. So to say a regular form of debt, not to say, like he also makes a distinction between payable and unpayable forms of debt, showing that, for example, even debt from above, for example, in the case of Haiti's so-called independence debt, it can be very power imbued. But what he does is that he says there is also something that he calls debts from below. And I am quoting now from his words. He says debts from below are the subterranean collective moral and political debts of history for colonialism, slavery, structural violence. And what he says is that this framing out to debt from below, it really invokes a radical shift in perspective, because then suddenly the majority world becomes the creditor instead of the debtor. So as such, debt from below, in Haven's words, can not only work as a mechanism of oppression, but really also as a way of building resistance and also challenging dominant social orders. So yes, in combining those perspectives, so to say, the iceberg metaphor and the debt from below, that's basically a little bit how this framework or this idea of invisible debts as a umbrella, as a conceptual umbrella for different forms of debt, which would be ecological debt, colonial debt, and reproductive debt, can be thought.
Thank you very much. I think you also said maybe you wanted to show an image on this point, or should we for the next? Okay, because then I would ask you again, Corinna, if you can work, or could you more explain in depth what just the last concepts you mentioned? What do you mean by ecological, colonial, and reproductive debts?
Yeah, thank you. Now I want to share the image.
Okay, great.
Just let me see. Exactly. So this question of what I mean by those three forms of debt, I think it's helpful to, so you don't have to imagine all of it, to maybe briefly show this image of the iceberg. So as I had said, this idea of the iceberg is something that Maria Mies and subsistence scholars in the 1980s really came up with. And what they did is that they showed, so they went back to Rosa Luxemburg, who always said that capitalism needs a non-capitalist milieu to stabilize itself. And they actually looked like, what does this non-capitalist milieu that is continuously, that is necessary for capital accumulation, but is at the same time invisibilized, exploited, destroyed in the terms of nature. What does this non-capitalist milieu consist of? And so they come up with what back then in the 80s they called the three colonies of white men, saying that on the one hand it's nature, on the other hand it's continued exploitation of the majority world despite formal decolonization, and on the third, so to say, internal colony would be social reproduction, so unpaid care work being constantly tapped, which until today is in its majority still done by women. And what I tried to do here then is translating really this idea of those three spheres in the underwater part of the iceberg to the language of debt from below. So namely to say there is from nature, it's ecological debt, then it's colonial debt and reproductive debts. So what's important to me here is to stress that I didn't invent those strands. They all exist. So they exist and they are being elaborated not only like in academia, or not even mainly in academia, but a lot by social movements and civil society organizations. They have been developed for decades. So I talked about ecological debts, like those debates starting off in the 1990s. The topic of colonial debts, I'm drawing in the article heavily on a book by Rocio Zambrana on colonial debts in Puerto Rico. And obviously also this works that I mentioned before on reparations campaigns, or for example, the CARICOM Reparations Commission. So also the sphere of colonial debt, like all this work on it has already existed for long and has seen renewed interest, so to say, and a repoliticization. And it's the same, I would argue, for feminist debt. So, for example, going back to the Wages for Housework campaign in the 1970s, already there, the idea was that capitalism owes women a debt for all the social reproductive work that, so to say, all the time is tapped and subsidizes the capitalist system. So, in the second part of the article, after introducing, so to say, this idea of invisible debt, I'm going back actually to also debates and literature and occasions also that already exist, and introduce those three different spheres of ecological debt, colonial debt, and reproductive debt. So it's really, as I said before, really more about creating maybe a common language or a common framing to find a language that we can use across those three fields of feminism, environmental justice, and decoloniality. And for me, the common denominator, or what really links ecological debt, colonial debt, and reproductive debt is really that all three of those concepts invert this traditional debtor-creditor relationship. So an example that is, I think, quite interesting here is I'm based in Austria, in Vienna now, but I'm from Germany, and I've been following this debate on Germany in 2021 officially apologizing for the genocide on the Herero and Namas peoples, and working on this joint declaration with Namibia, offering 1.1 billion in official development aid to Namibia over the last 30 years. And I think that's one particularly interesting case to say, no, official development aid is not the same thing as colonial debt, and it's not the same thing as reparative justice. And many, including Sir Herrero and Namas themselves, have argued that this whole framing again maintains, so to say, Namibia's subordinate status as an aid recipient rather than recognizing them as a rightful creditor of colonial debt. So it again really reproduces neo-colonial relations instead of overcoming them by really changing and inverting this idea of who owes whom. And I'm currently editing a book on feminist ecological economics together with my friend and colleague Birte Strunk, and actually ran from WoMin together with her colleague Marta Gaurich from WoMin and Miriam Lang from the Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar in Quito in Ecuador. They contribute to this volume chapter titled From Development to Reparations, Reframing North-South Relations Through a Feminist Ecological Economics Lens. And along these lines, I think it's really about this perspective of overcoming this idea of development aid and really talking about reparations, talking about an acknowledgement of invisible debts as something that can then give legitimacy also to claims for debt cancellation, for reparations. And all this is paramount if we're really if we're striving for intersectional global justice as a horizon of transformation. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. We can later in the pause, if you have questions, we can go more deeper into some aspects if there is the appetite for. But then I would switch to Reine. For you, I would ask, you've been working in WoMin on debt and reparations for many years. What do you think on the theoretical approach presented by Corinna, and what is your approach working on debt and reparations in WoMin?
Merci Nicolas. Bonjour.
Thank you, Nicolas.
Bonsoir à tous.
And hello, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the planet right now. Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for organizing such an important debate. And thank you, Corinna, for your presentation. Corinna, I had the chance to meet you virtually some months ago during an exchange with Miriam Lang and Marta Garich. And so it is such a pleasure to be here to share the experience of women on debts and reparation. So now to answer your question, Nicola, I think that the theoretical approach, Corinna's theoretical approach and the framework that she establishes on this invisible debt, being ecological, reproductive, or colonial, well, this is totally in line with the political vision of women. The framework, our framework, is the same, and our approach is to ask a fundamental question: who owes whom? Who is the owner of what, and who owes whom? So the dominant perspective that is predominant in the international institutions like the African Development Bank or the World Bank and so on, all these institutions present countries from the South and countries of the global majority of the world as debtors, the non-disciplined debtors that must honor their debts. However, there is the decolonial and eco-feminist perspective which say totally the opposite. They reverse this narrative and they show that it is countries from the global north and international financial institutions and businesses from the north, which have a historical immense debt towards the global south and towards the majority of the world. And I'm referring here to the countries of the global south. So, and this is like the terminology that is currently used. So, this is declined in three different dimensions that Corinna has just detailed. Colonial debt that comes from looting, from the historical looting of our resources, of colonized countries. Also, the ecological and climate debt, which is provoked by the appropriation of the atmosphere and of the space. And then there's the model, the neoliberal model, and the reproductive debt, which is this immense invisible debt that comes from the work that has been done for caring for social reproduction, for subsistence, this work that is carried out by women. And this work that has been taken for granted and has been developed by women in rural areas and in working areas, and they have been the target. And it is upon these women that the capitalist system resides, actually, as Corinna was saying. So our approach, our approach is not so much to go from the common theory to common practice. So what do I understand by this? The specificity of our approach in women is complementary to the theoretical framework that Corinna has described. The theory is, of course, fundamental in order to set the discourse and who is creditor and who is debtor, but our approach is aligned with popular education and the construction of campaigns from the bottom to the top. So these macroeconomic concepts are a resistance tool for women with whom we work. So how do we do? Sovereign debt and climate debt are very complex and sometimes they're reserved to experts and they're debated in great capitals like Geneva and Washington and Brussels and so on. In women, we use methodologies that are based on popular education. They're based on experiences and we try to educate women from the grassroots, women who are resisting. They're resisting, for example, they're working in mines, in golden mines in Burkina Faso, or women who are working for hydrologic dams in the Ivory Coast. We build our methodologies based on their experience, on what they have been experiencing. We have the woman leader education, which is training for political leadership amongst the rural women and in order to face extractivism. And this training combines critical analysis. So it combines critical analysis on the oppression system. It also combines the use of local languages and practical knowledge. This is a horizontal training. It really allows to horizontalize the know-how of these women so that this collective know-how can be consolidated. And it helps build solidarity, a pan-African eco-feminist solidarity. When health circuits are cut because of austerity policies imposed by international financial institutions to reimburse the financial debt of the states, or whenever there are communities who don't have access to water or to forests because of mega projects like mines or dams or whatever, women understand immediately that they will have to pay the debts. with their health, with their work, with their time, with their energy. So our approach allows us to unify the struggle and the strive instead of fragmenting it. So we try to build campaigns in a unified manner. So we don't carry out isolated actions depending on different countries. We build Pan-African networks in order to support women, in order to support communities in the field, in front of giants like international financial institutions and businesses. So we reinforce Pan-African solidarity and the unification of the voices of women in Western, Eastern, Northern, and Southern Africa, so that we can demand reparation for this invisible debt. And we also expose the real responsible, those who are really responsible. We try to make visible the destructive role of international financial institutions and businesses based in the patriarchal extractive methods. We reinforce negotiations and we denounce, we refuse this facade debt, and our work allows us to target these three actors that, according to us, they are at the very core of the destructive capitalist system, like international financial institutions, which are imposing neoliberal reforms. And by doing so, they destroy social and economic layers in the state. Also, multinational firms, which destroy our common goods, our resources, our forests and rivers with total impunity. And also states which bend in front of the impositions. So our approach allows us to say that, well, the force of the theory that Corinna very well described in her intervention, this gives us conceptual arguments, solid arguments, to say that we owe nothing. And in the framework of Africa, we owe nothing. Women and communities owe nothing, and we will pay nothing. It's rather the opposite. It is northern countries which owe us reparations, and we will demand for that.
Thank you very much. This was really powerful. Maybe if you could, Reine, if you could also share some concrete success stories, which would really be helpful and inspiring. Yeah, it would be if you have some success from WoMin's work on reparations. You talked a lot already about the popular education, but if you may have more examples, this would be also so great if you want to share it with us.
Merci Nicolas. Thank you, Nicola. Maybe, yeah, can you hear me? Yes, we can. About this second question, it is important to precise how we define success in general terms in our work and in particular when it comes to reparation. To us, reparations are not limited to financial transaction or compensations. The real success for women is in the capacity of the communities of agricultural women and their capacity to stop, to put an end to exploitation, to find their common goods and impose their own alternatives. According to these logics, we understand that it is a long-term work, and maybe I would mention two main progresses to highlight this strategic step: politicization and reconquête of African women vis-à-vis extractivism. Women travail is working so that the women are not perceived as just case studies or passive beneficiaries of a system on which they would have no control. On the contrary, as legitimate political actors facing patriarchal extractivism. So what we carry out in with the different solutions that we carry out in several countries through our national partners and our allies. What we put forward feminist participatory action research or the analysis of ecofeminism as well as other popular education tools such as training, women learning liberation, which is a parcours of training of 18 months. We are in an ascendant, in a growing dynamic with the development of women, of peasant women and workers who are the target of our work and the reason of existing. Even though the path is long and there are many challenges to be faced, women of the communities we accompany, they are consolidating their leadership with strength to denounce, to report the oppression systems that they are facing and they are suffering from. We have the Climate Assembly of Women for Western and Central Africa, the Convergence of Women of Eastern Africa for the Earth and Climate, and other politicized spaces which are at an infra level as well as at national level. In Nigeria, women, for instance, get organized around a national platform, as well as in Cameroon. And well, that's it. We also have the second example I might mention is the unification of fights beyond the national borders. So this Pan-African social movement built by women, so in a more specific way in our work about debt and reparation. Reparation matter is always, well, depending on the rooming programmatic work, a program devoted, specifically devoted to debt and reparation is relatively recent. It was 3 or 4 years ago when we started to explore in a more specific way this subject. We devoted specific resources for the work of debt and reparation. During this period, two main subjects. We carried out analysis of ecofeminist cost in participatory schedules, allowing women to document and quantify by themselves the real economic and environmental impacts of the daily activities. They assess the loss of degradation of hydric resources, the relative increase of the workload, unpaid workload. This is tangible, whilst debt is visible. We could carry out these works and we still draw lessons that allow us to readjust methodologies, to improve our methodologies, keeping oriented towards the recommendations of women and communities. For example, in Cameroon, we analyzed the cost where women, well, this has allowed women to understand the real losses they were suffering from and how this extractive project of this hydroelectric dam increased the working load, the unpaid workload, on the basis of this critical comprehension, and they started the negotiations with the Development African Bank and the multinationals to negotiate agreements which should be fairer. It is a process of learning in that we are crossing through, I think, in Madagascar as well as in Burkina Faso, in Côte d'Ivoire and Cameroon as well as Zimbabwe. The campaign of reparations targeting the Banque Africaine de Développement, initially it was articulated around extractive projects funded by the Banque Africaine de Développement, and they put together the local resistances of women in Western and Central Africa. So I think that I will stop here. I wish I responded to this second question.
Yes, I think that's a lot of examples already. Thank you very much. So you partly answered the last question I have to both of you, but you're happy then to work further on it. The last question would be to both. Where do you see the potential working on debt and reparations to push forward the decolonial agendas in your spaces and beyond, thinking about Pan-African movements for reparation, but also about the university in your case, Corinna? And how can the feminist and decolonial theories and practices, which you just have explained so well to us, can help bring policy change? So here it's more there, because also that, a lot of people who are joining today, we by the way, we are more than 100 people joining for those, because you can't see the number, more than 100 people joining. A lot of us are working on policy spaces and working on transformative change. So if you, both of you, free or who wants to answer first, would be this: how can feminist and decolonial theories and practice help to bring policy change in your areas, and what do you see the potential in your areas to bring change? I don't know who wants to answer, speak first.
You want to go first, Ren? I don't mind, however you want.
Corinna, je laisse le soin à Corinna de commencer.
So I will let you, Corinna. I will let you start, Corinna.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great and obviously also quite big question. Thanks, Nicola and Ren, for all that you have elaborated on. So yeah, I think in principle, this notion of invisible debts can really serve as a discursive intervention, provocation, disruption in all kind of policy and also academic and policy discourses that really only focus on this tip of the iceberg, which always think about, as Ren has said, always think about the global south, the majority world, as a debtor instead of a creditor. So I think invisible debts have, so to say, the potential to subvert standard approaches to debt from above and give legitimacy to revolutionary realpolitik demands for like reparations, debt cancellation, for example. And if you talk about my spaces, what came to my mind now was degrowth, because degrowth is a space that I've been working in for the last probably 10 years by now. And one of the reasons, or one of the things that drew me to degrowth was really that it's not only a scholarly, but it's a scholar activist discourse that really takes this idea of environmental justice, ecological debt, as I've mentioned in the beginning, quite central. So it's the global dimension, and for example, the double global injustice, so to say, that those who contribute least to ecological collapse are usually the ones hit hardest, like both like on a geographical, geopolitical idea, but also within countries, no, like from a class perspective, for example. Those are things that in degrowth scholarship were articulated from very early on, but honestly, one thing that I was quite concerned about in the last years was now that degrowth is being offered spaces that I think were unthinkable 10 years ago, like big EU-funded projects, like the Beyond Growth conference in the European Parliament. Like, I'm not saying like it's still a niche discourse in a way, but still like there are many more platforms which are much more relevant to policymakers. What I've been observing, and together with my colleague Miriam Lang, again here we tried to make an intervention, is that suddenly there is a strong policy focus that, for example, the EU project calls is very much focused on policies. But then when people work on policies, the policy list starts to get very Eurocentric. So suddenly everybody talks about wage working time reduction, about universal basic services, about community energy provisioning. And I'm not saying any of this is unimportant, but what started worrying me is that this commitment to global justice that was very integral to the degrowth discourse from the beginning, it seemed to be rather absent in many of those policy lists. I think it has to do with many things. One can say, well, it's an EU-funded project. One can say, well, for reparations, we don't know what institutions to talk to. But still, there was one report last year where in the end, like they clustered different policies, whether they are regional, national, European, or global. And the only one which was clustered global, while at the same time national and regional and European, was global participatory dialogue. And I was like, well, if that's the most radical thing we can think about, like there's no material redistribution side at all to this. So I've been trying also together with my colleague Miriam Lang, and we had the honor to learning from WoMin and from Reine and from Marta in this regard. We've been trying to make an intervention there to show that really this taking this commitment to intersectional global justice seriously does require, so to say, policies that are about global redistribution, does require a commitment to reparations, to acknowledging invisible debts. So we wrote an article which is about to be published any day now. It's called Debts and Reparations, Rerouting Degrowth Policy Horizons in an Intersectional Global Justice Agenda, for a special issue on degrowth and global interdependencies. And in it, we really try to show, we also have the two concrete examples. So the one being Sayasuni and different dimensions of reparations present in the case of Yasuni, which Miriam has long worked on, and the second one actually WoMin, where we learned from Reine and Marta, to show for those two debates on reparations what actually degrowth can learn for it and why it is worthwhile and necessary to embrace those. And maybe just to add one small thing, for me, one of the biggest learnings I had, and we also reflect on it in this article, one of the biggest learnings I had from the conversations with Marta and Reine and their work in WoMin is really that quantification, which in this article I shared with all of you, I'm rather skeptical about, because my feeling was, okay, now suddenly people quantify and say in the end, that's the number of total invisible debt. And in the end, there lurks a danger of narrowing down a strong and meaningful and telling concept to an objectified number, and suddenly everybody only talks about methodology. So I've been in parts quite critical about only this idea of if we just quantified invisible debts, that would be the way to go. But one of the things that I've learned from WoMin is really that their popular education sehr popular education methods of this ecofeminist cost-benefit analysis, where suddenly so it's not abstract numbers which are calculated from the top down, but they actually have also relational qualities such as consent, trust, accountability, reciprocity. And it really can also be used, again, maybe a little bit like this debt from above, debt from below, like just quantifying can be a means of oppression, but actually quantification in the sense of how woman does it, it can also be actually a way of building resistance. And that's one of the things that we reflect on in this intervention to the degrowth discourse. And yeah, in total, I hope that in this space, which is quite familiar to me, this call for more for more policies that are really about global redistribution and that really are about going from, as the title from Ren's, Miriam's and Martha's chapter is, going from development to reparations, that some of those things are picked up there. Let's see.
Thank you very much, Corinna. Reine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicola. Also, Corinna. I think it is important to tackle this issue. It is at the heart of Ronnie's work. Corinna said many interesting things that I share. I would like to underline, to link it with this article that we wrote with Miriam and Martha. In the frame of the book Corinna mentioned, we could then by this illustrate the complementarity, the conceptual complementarity and academic of us who are militants and activists, and Miriam is also an academicist who is represented, so well represented by this academic rigor, represented by the works and theoretic scheme. Corinna, the alliance between the decolonial theory, depth and reparation have a huge potential. They can allow us to repolitize macroeconomic debates, which are too often technocratic. So, we are talking from a place where African women who are wearing the cost of extractive capitalist model are 100% actresses or players to bring solutions to demand reparations. Corinna also mentioned the case of Herrero and Enenama with the help. Sorry for some inconveniences because the sound is a bit chopped. Well, she also highlighted in which way the fact that Germany was paying compensations to Rutnama, and the acceptation of the acceptance of this financial contribution was not clear. Well, these questions or amplificates the structures of power and domination and neoliberal rapport de force. For WoMin also, reparations to us go beyond financial compensation, and when we analyze the cost the cost to, well, whenever it is possible, well, we'll link economic cost to some losses. I think that this go beyond the single monetary question. It is a process that allow women to take the control of narrative, which is invisibilizing the debt. So the cost of debt is not owned by nature and the women's of the communities. Well, there is really this repoliticization challenge and redefinition of debt as a mechanism, well, with a potential of transformative and structural power. And this is this view that we are thinking of reparation, and we are building our tools around reparation as a model, as a new paradigm.
It's a new paradigm that wants a change of forces because decision makers demand standardized data, but this does not reflect the reality. This does not reflect the reality of women, and women are just absorbers. They become absorbers of economic change in moments of crisis of the capitalist system. Right now, whenever a state cannot pay the debt, it's always women who will have to provide more time for care, and this time is not compensated. There is no remuneration for this time. So it's very important to show the result of the analysis of the cost so that we can oppose to this traditional perspective. There are lots of quantitative data, and there are feminist economists which have theorized about this approach, and they have questioned this narrative. This narrative of quantitative data and standard data that does not reflect the reality of women and the communities in front of this extractivistic system. So we're trying to take care of this non-remunerated work that is made by women. And decision makers should try to compensate for that, and women also, they have to become aware of what they have been losing through time so that they can ask for reparation. And I would like to say that regarding reparation, when there is reparation for the continent, there's the African Union that declared some reparations and the need for reparation for decades, and then there was the recognition by the United Nations of slaverism, and then all the movements, all the anti-slavery movements and the reparation movements for the Afro descendants in the African continent are taking shape, and our requirements for reparation and the climate date are now becoming more visible. And all this model gave birth to this situation. And now the decolonial economy is helping us navigate. There are also alleviations of the debt. There are minimal compensations right now, but we have to keep pushing and ask for structural change. We need to require these reparations to the financial institutions like the African Development Bank, and we need to ask the states to be liable and to be able to protect the common goods and the interest of their community in front of the requirements of globalized capitalism.
Thank you, Reine. This was again a lot of information, very useful. We have now the last minutes to come to questions from the audience, from the participants. Thank you very much for those who have been putting questions already in the chat. For those who haven't, now is your moment. I have two, one very concrete, which is for Reine, which would be how to become a WoMin member. This is by choice and Cewente question done. And the second may be more directed to Corinna, which would be, are you able for the one working in the global north in European universities to lobby so that the colonial institutions funding your work look at your works as the proof of how damaging it is, neocolonialism, and every level, and why they should also stop reproducing it right now and not just compensate it after the damage is done. And reference is made to the recognizing one of 3 genocides Germany perpetrated and or actively participated is a good beginning for reparative justice, but preventing current one in Palestine and Sudan to happen at all would be vital too. So repoliticizing your academic work to be useful to prevent the current oppression still happening to happen at all. By Laila. I would, for this round, let's see if we have another one now. I would add also one question to Reine. And then maybe with these 3 questions, we will close. Reine, you have also, Corinna, you have talked a lot about the quantification issue, and you also have said that from feminist movement, quantification has been criticized a lot, but on the other hand, going into spaces of economic and financial decision-making spaces, quantification is a useful tool, or can be a useful tool. Quantifying climate debt and quantifying colonial debt, there has been a lot of work done already. What can we as feminists do to also push forward those arguments or those studies or those analyses, any tool which can help us to quantify or to also to visibilize those reproductive debts, which I have the feeling that the reproductive debts coming with these claims into economic and financial spaces sometimes gets really difficult. Reine, you have already mentioned a lot about the methodology, but if you have some more specific proposals on how can we visibilize, what tool can we use for showing these invisible reproductive debts in economic spaces, this would be great. Okay, I have this, yes. For Reine, the third question also about how to become a WoMin member, and then Corinna going back to university, lobby, and reparative justice. Are the questions clear? Yes? Okay. Maybe let's start with Corinna, and then we will finish the round with Reine.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with your question on quantification. Nicola, thank you for both the questions, also to Laila. And the question of how can we make visible reproductive debt, or how can we talk about it in economic circles? So I'm going back again now to the Wages for Housework campaign, where Silvia Federici was one of the main voices in the 70s. And I think at some point she was also asked, how would you quantify, so to say, the debt owed, or how should it be financed? And she said, well, I'm not so treasury department, like they should do that work. What I do is that I'm saying here, and it reminded me a bit of what Ren did before, when Ren said, we don't owe. We don't owe. It's not about, so to say, to negate the stories that are so powerful still in financial institutions, rather than now trying to do all the work of quantifying for that. In the end, what happens is that, so with this obsession of numbers, what happens is that we often reduce very complex realities to numbers, like was ruining any chance for realities to speak for themselves. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be done at all, and we shouldn't, so to say, it's a wrong strategy altogether. I'm not doing it. I'm sometimes criticizing it, but I also see the value of that. But I think we shouldn't fall prey to this idea that if we only had the exact quantification of the debt owed, that would give us more power than by what we already know and what we can already, so to say, fight for in civil society organizations and social movements. So I think, yeah, that's maybe what I wanted to say here. And I mean, about the other points that Laila had mentioned, of course, I fully agree that it's a starting point, but never enough, and that complicity in ongoing genocides. I mean, it is a little bit of a different story, complicity versus being the colonial power in place at the time, but still, I think reparative justice cannot be reached as long as one is complicit in all of that. And I try on various levels to change institutions I'm employed in, but it's tough. So even like with the work on invisible debt, I do find platforms like this platform where people are really interested in it, and I do find platforms where people are, how in times of an authoritarian turn in Europe can you even start making such suggestions, which again would deprivilege people? Like, there is also resistance from this side I'm trying to hold against. I'm very convinced that if we give up on intersectional global justice as the horizon of where we want to go, like, then what transformation are we going to talk about? So, but I just want to say I fully agree with what you're saying, that it can be a starting point, but it's obviously not enough. Just seconding that.
Thank you, Corinna. Now it seems that at the end the chat starts to to be relived, but I will now invite Reine to do the final answering, or if you want to add anything, then now I'll give you the floor. And with this, I'm sorry, we have to come to the end of this dialogue. So Reine, the floor is yours.
Ok, alors,
So,
je sais pas si j'ai tout bien pris les questions,
I
mais je
don't
sais
know
qu'il y
if
a
I
une
got all the
cinquantaine de
questions
membres
right. Well,
de
there's one
WoMin.
about the membership of
Je
women.
pense que peut-être
So,
rapidement juste dire que
yeah, very
WoMin
quickly, I'd like to
comme
say
c'est une
that Women
organisation
is an
qui n'a pas forcément un
organization
membership, donc il n'y a pas de
which does
possibilité
not
de devenir membre de WoMin.
necessarily
Mais je
has
pense
a
que nous
membership,
travaillons
so there's no
en
such thing as the
alliance
possibility to
avec
become a
des
member of Women.
partenaires et des alliés à
We work in
travers
alliance with
l'Afrique et le
other
monde
partners,
pour
with
voilà, faire
other
avancer les
organizations
les
in
familles
Africa and the
africaines et
world
les
so
femmes
that we can make the
marginalisées
cause
par les
of
systèmes
African
patriarcales
women move
capitalistes.
forward, and also the cause of all those
Maintenant,
women who are
je crois qu'il y a aussi une question
marginalized
sur
because of
les
patriarch
réparations.
capitalist.
Pense-t-on que les
And now
réparations sont
regarding
reconnues
reparations,
indispensables
well,
étant donné qu'on
reparations
ne s'attaque
are
qu'à la question de l'esclavage,
recognized
mais
as
qu'on n'a pas reconnu, il est nécessaire de
indispensable,
reconnaître la
but
colonisation comme une violation
there's
des droits de l'homme, elle aussi.
decolonization that has to be recognized as a violation of human rights. And I think that this question is totally relevant, and it is a source of many debates in movements for reparation, in Black movements. And I think that, well, first of all, we need to recognize this first stage, this recognition, this acknowledgement of slaverism. And how would that legitimize reparations? Well, I think that this is a question that is important to tackle. And this is something that must be discussed at all levels. But for us, it's always important. Well, the framework of the United Nations, we know that multinational spaces and the United Nations have never really, let's say, provided or brought any framework that would be binding from a legal point of view. So, I mean, it is not binding, it is not legally binding to demand reparation. But for social movements, for communities, for women who are at the front line, who are resisting to this capitalistic, extractivistic model, and for these women and people who are suffering from oppression systems such as slaverism, colonization, apartheid, well, to understand the domination system that they're subject to, and to understand how extractivism and the colonial model are dominant, well, reparations appear as a reality, as an intrinsic reality for women communities in Africa. And these women communities and the diaspora get organized in order to receive those reparations. And these reparations are the restitutions of certain artifacts that have been looted during colonialism, or there are other reparations such as financial reparations. There are mechanisms by international financial institutions to respond to these violations of human rights that are suffered by communities. So there are some gates, there are some mechanisms that can be used by communities to articulate the reparations and to demand justice and liability.
Thank you. We just saw that right at the end, there have become a lot of questions inside. We can't, for time reason, we can't respond to the questions. But the proposal is we gather now these questions, and we'll try to respond to them in written form. So we hear you, but we can't have time to answer right now. And with this, I'll have to finish, and last words. Thank you very much, Reine and Corinna. I have 4 takeaways. One is that invisible debts is extremely powerful, what you said, to convert the dominant debate about who owes whom. Then we heard a lot about the power of ecofeminist methodologies used by WoMin, especially popular education, but also methodologies where women decide on what they want to put and what they want to show. Not getting obsessed with the quantification would be the third one, and the very important one is we do not owe. And with these words, I will pass to Soraya to have the closing words. Thank you very much. Also, answering the record will be published, as Amy said, in Eurodat's and ODT's YouTube channels. So you can spread them, and you can send them to your friends afterwards. Go ahead, Soraya.
Thank you so much, Nicola, and thank you for facilitating the conversation. That's much appreciated. A special thanks to Corinna and Ren for joining us. It's lovely to meet you online here, and thank you for helping us to explore this very big, important questions. I'm sure that the conversations will continue after this webinar, and we very much hope that you will take some of the reflections, some of the ideas in your work. As Nicola said earlier, we are all, debating them, discussing them, and always finding the ways how to put them in practice in our everyday work and our activities and so on. So thank you for that. And thank you very much to all the colleagues from ODG and Eurodat for making this happen, and to all of you for joining us this afternoon for this really, really interesting webinar. So have a lovely afternoon.